The rise of China means different things for the United States and Australia. For the United States, it represents the rise of a potential geopolitical rival. And of course for Australia, it's a rapidly developing trade relationship. It's now Australia's largest trade partner and has been for the last 5 years. And a lot of economists say that China's lust for our raw materials is one of the main reasons why Australia weathered the financial crisis. Meanwhile, Australia has this very strong, long-held security agreement with the United States since 1951. In fact, this year marks the 60th anniversary. Do you think Australia can still ride two horses simultaneously?
I think that Australia is experiencing what a lot of countries are experiencing, including the United States, by the way. China is the second largest economy in the world. China is a global economic presence. I'll give you an indication. For the United States, China is one of our leading trade partners right now, our largest creditor. We're their largest export market. So I think that it's not unusual, given the breadth of Chinese economic power, that many countries would end up having priority relations with it in the economic sphere. I don't see that that poses some kind of test for Australia, because I think, as a former American diplomat, Australia is one of our, without any question, 2 or 3 most important allies in the world, and the ANZUS Treaty is sacrosanct for both countries, if you will. It's terribly important for the United States as it is for Australia. I don't see that Australia needs to choose between those two relationships.
What about if there is a standoff in the Taiwan Straits? I mean, we had a spat in early 1996 when the Taiwanese had their first democratic elections, and the Chinese intimidated that process by lobbing missiles in the Taiwan Straits. There was some tension there. In 2004, I think it was in August of 2004, the then Foreign Minister Alexander Downer answered a hypothetical question in Beijing and said that the ANZUS alliance would not be invoked if there was a spat between Beijing and Washington over Taiwan. Now, at the time, the Labor Party opposition condemned Alexander Downer, and he quickly distanced himself from those remarks. But we've heard of a gaffe in Washington as something that's someone inadvertently telling the truth. Was Downer inadvertently telling the truth, and is this a sign of things to come?
At one point in my career, I was State Department spokesman, and I learned a very important lesson: never answer a hypothetical question. I never did, and I rarely do now. I would say this. It's been impressive to see the degree to which China and Taiwan have produced a better relationship between them, the level of trade, the level of visits back and forth. So the reality of China-Taiwan relations in 2011 is very far from 1996, or very far from even 2004 when Alexander Downer made those remarks. I would say this, however. I think that the complicating factor for both Australia and the United States will be this. We have to get along with China. China is too big and too powerful, too omnipresent economically for us to try to contain it or isolate it, and so both of us have chosen a policy of engagement. And in my country, that policy is supported by both the Republican leadership and the Democratic leadership. However, there's nothing more important than our defense relationships, and the ANZUS Treaty, now in its, as you say, in its 60th year, is a bedrock of America's position in Asia, and I know it's vitally important for Australia. And I would have to think, in any profound security crisis in Asia, I would have to think the United States and Australia would be on the same side and would be working together, hopefully to forestall the crisis and to produce a peaceful outcome. But I can't imagine a situation where Australia and the United States would be separated on a major security.
What about if a Taiwanese leader, such as, say, President Lee in the late 1990s, pushed the issue and talked about Taiwan becoming independent, and then China reacted in a hostile manner? This is what Downer said. The US Alliance for Mutual Defence, and again this was off the cuff and he answered the hypothetical which he quickly distanced himself from, but he said the alliance between Australia and the US is evoked only in the event of an attack on either country. So some other activity elsewhere in the world doesn't invoke it. Now, of course, by contrast, the United States, as you well know, is obliged by its Taiwan Relations Act from the late 70s to come to Taiwan's defence. You still confident that Australia would always be there by America's side in the event of a tension there?
Again, I'm not going to answer, even as a private citizen now, a hypothetical question, because I know how dangerous they are. But I would say that I was Undersecretary of State, I was ambassador to NATO. I spent a lot of my career working with allies in Europe and in Asia. I believe Australia is one of our single most important and strongest allies. I'm not just talking about Australia's commitment to us, our commitment to Australia. We live in a time when the United States is increasingly focused on Asia and the Pacific region. It's the most vital region of engagement for us, looking forward. China's the most complicated part of that equation for us. And I cannot imagine a situation, a crisis developing in Asia that would separate Australia and the United States. I cannot imagine that happening because my sense is that both governments are fundamentally dedicated to the other and that we tend to see things in the same way. We tend to have the same basic instincts about how one would act or should not act in a crisis. And so without taking the bait and answering specifically the hypothetical question, I don't have many doubts that Australia and the United States would be together in trying to manage a crisis for peaceful purposes.
So you're very confident that America can still maintain a very strong leadership role in Asia over the next 20 or so years?
I'm more than confident.
More than confident.
It's essential that we do it.
The Labor government of Prime Minister Kevin Rudd 2 years ago came out with the Defence White Paper. And in the preface, the then Defence Minister, he's now no longer the Defence Minister, he's too gone, but he says, he highlights, quote, the beginning of the end of the so-called unipolar moment, the almost 2-decade-long period in which the preeminence of our principal ally, the United States, was without question. He says the beginning of the end. And of course, a lot of the pundits, including the Wall Street Journal editorial page, used this or interpreted the Australian military build-up as a result of the Defence White Paper as a sign that Canberra was preparing for US withdrawal from the region.
And I think there's nothing that can be further from the truth. I mean, the difficult thing for the United States as we enter the second decade of the 21st century is that we are going to remain, in my judgment, the single most important and most powerful country in the world for decades. China will not overtake the United States in power, in total power, perhaps ever. And yet our relative power is going to diminish because one of the great stories of our time, as you know, is that India, Brazil, China are all three rising to global power. A number of countries, including Indonesia, in this region rising to regional power. So the United States is going to have to learn to share power a little bit more globally. And that period that you refer to of the unipolar moment, Charles Krauthammer's phrase, it was an unusual period in global history. But I know that the United States is going to remain the largest single power. I know that Asia will be the most vital region of engagement. It's very important that we maintain our strength here. And I think, in fact, as I've said at the conference here in Sydney, that the United States should seek to remain the predominant power in Asia through our alliance system with Australia and South Korea and Japan and our partnerships with the Philippines and Thailand. That is a goal that I think we can achieve, and I don't see China eclipsing the United States in military power at any time in my life.
Now, you've spoken a lot about continuity in administrations over several decades.
Yes.
What about the Guam Doctrine, President Nixon's Guam Doctrine in the late 1960s, where he did formally declare a sense of limitations to American power and encouraged allies in the region to be more assertive and look after its defence more appropriately? Did the Nixon Doctrine mark any kind of change? And that was 40 years ago, and we're still talking about having strong US presence in the region, 100,000 troops and strong alliances. Did the Nixon Doctrine mark a radical departure? Well,
you know, I think it came at the end of another unusual period in history of absolute American power during the early part of the Cold War. It's American policy that we should retain our alliance system. It's American policy, and it's a hope of the United States, that our allies will remain strong. I think what impresses a lot of us about Australia is how capable Australia is militarily, how it punches well above its weight, and it has the political will to use its military for peaceful purposes, but, you know, to use its military when times are tough, as Australia proved in East Timor, as it proved in the Solomons, as it proved in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was ambassador to NATO, and there's a different reality in our other alliance, our 28 allies in Western Europe and North America. Many of them find their military capabilities atrophying because they're not spending the money, paying the attention that I think Australia is, Japan certainly is, to beef up and to modernize their defense forces. So the worry of American strategic planners is not about Australia or Japan or South Korea. It's more about our allies in Western Europe. You've seen in Libya how weak the NATO alliance is when the United States is not playing the lead military role and taking the point on the military operations. And so that's the crisis that I worry more about.